So I want to welcome everyone tonight to Crash's first speaker series of 2024. We have Susan Joudrey with us, who is an educational expert and historian, presenting one of my favorite papers. And I'm going to keep talking this up because it's amazing. So without any further ado, I think I will turn it over to Susan and I will get over with them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this evening in person and online. And thank you, Leslie, for inviting me again to share this research, which has been in progress since the summer of 2019. And the first time I had the opportunity to talk about this research, this project was March 13th, 2020,
Wow.
which was, the day before my birthday, but also the day that in Nova Scotia, the universities decided to move to remote teaching because of the pandemic. And so the pandemic definitely stalled this project a little bit, but it's also like I've been living with the history and present of public health for the last 4 years. So tonight I'm going to tell you a bit about the perpetuation of eugenic thought through one specific university course in the first half of the 20th century, how students applied the principles of eugenics to their own communities, and why my father thought this was his worst class. And my father, pictured here with me, this is the last photo that we had together. I was extremely pregnant and uncomfortable. And he was terminally ill with cancer. So this is the last picture that we took. But my father, he was really the catalyst for this project, although he'll never know that, which might have suited him just fine because he was both humble and fairly private. But George Joudrey is what we refer to now as a first-generation mature student. He arrived at Mount Allison University in 1953. In 1928, he was born to Dorothy Vino in New Bern, Nova Scotia, and was primarily raised by his grandmother, Albertha Vino, maiden name Eisenhower, while Dorothy worked in Middleton, Nova Scotia. Dorothy married his stepfather, Orrin Joudrey, when George was about 8 years old, and he was 17 when the Second World War ended, and he started teaching. He eventually went to normal school to complete his teacher training, and he was 25 when he decided to try university. He received a scholarship, majored in history, and he did very well. But when he talked about his courses, there was one in particular that really stood out in his memory. A personal hygiene course that he was adamant he didn't do very well in. In fact, he considered it his worst course. According to George, this course was mandatory to meet the requirements for graduation. And so I decided to look into this 2 years after my father's death because I was kind of curious about why this particular course was considered important enough that was, at least in my father's memory, mandatory. The university curricula at Mount Allison in the early 20th century was, from today's standards, very sparse. The calendar timetable included what would have been considered core to the disciplines. So classes for a Bachelor of Arts degree fit within a Monday to Saturday schedule. And this is consistent in the 1936 to 1955 academic calendars, 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. in 1-hour blocks. Now, history often reflects the intersections of people's lives, and with the help of Mount Allison's University archivist, David Mawhinney, who also happens to originate from Nova Scotia's South Shore, we determined that the course was Biology 3, Physiology and Hygiene in the fall term, and Introductory Bacteriology in the winter term, later to become Biology 3 or Biology 301. So this course, which from here on I'll refer to as Biology 3 or the Public Health course, was required for the completion of a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Science in Home Economics, including 2-year normal and dietetics, which in 1948 became a teaching major, nutrition major, and clothing major streams, secretarial, pre-medicine, pre-dental, and pre-nursing. So the only Mount Allison students who would have been exempt from this course were fine arts students, music students, and engineering students, as well as any students who could be formally excused by the university president. The 1954-55 academic calendar is the first time that this course wasn't listed as a requirement. And my father's year was the last year that Biology 3 was mostly mandatory. Now, David not only provided me with the academic calendar course description, but offered to scan and send me a copy of my father's final assignment. The collection of Biology 3 course assignments is most likely one of the few substantial collections of evaluations for a single course. So during the remainder of this talk, I'm going to introduce you to this mostly mandatory class and the results of the student public health assignments produced about communities in the South Shore of Nova Scotia, which is the region where my father grew up and didn't leave. And by focusing on this region, we can take an in-depth look at how students made sense of what they were learning in Biology 3. Eugenics was a pervasive ideology during the 20th century, and schools and education were definitely important social mechanisms for inculcating a generation of students to appreciate the potential for societal improvement. Biology 3 endeavored to train students to recognize public health as foundational to building responsible citizenry. Its designer and instructor, Roy Fraser, was a member of the Eugenic Society of Canada and a devout eugenicist who often extolled the importance of education for curing society's ills. And it's been argued by a number of scholars that more traditional definitions of eugenics needs to be expanded to recognize the undercurrents of eugenics in 20th century attempts at progressive health reform. Often these activities sought to monitor and discipline those experiencing poverty, especially women. And the Biology 3 public health assignments provide an example of these types of seemingly progressive actions because they encourage students to discipline themselves and survey others, especially lower class families. It's evident from the student assignments that poverty, demonstrated by quality of housing, number of family members, and the ability to secure and maintain employment, was associated with laziness, reduced mental capacity, and immorality. So taught by Roy Fraser, the personal hygiene and public health course fits into this history of promotion of eugenic thought in Atlantic Canada during the first half of the 20th century and aligns with the popular use of education for social control. Oh, maybe that. Yeah, just press the screen, maybe. Click on the screen. Yeah, there we go. Roy Fraser. So, who was Roy Fraser? He was professor of biology and bacteriology at Mount Allison from 1921 to 1955. He received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Toronto and completed a master's at the University of Kansas, focusing his studies on bacteriology and immunology. He worked in New York City as a resident pathologist at Seaside Hospital, which provided services to children living in impoverished conditions. And he was appointed superintendent of the Arbuckle Institute, which was a settlement house and charitable hospital associated with the Presbyterian Church, before he basically became the biology department at Mount Allison University. Fraser had been a provincial and national officer of the Canadian Red Cross Society. He was a strong proponent for the importance of field work and public health education and founded the Mount Allison Pre-Medical Society. He received honorary doctorates from Mount Allison and posthumously from Dalhousie University. It's no secret that eugenicists intentionally identified education as a way to advance their ideology. The Eugenic Society of Canada had set an objective to facilitate an education program of race betterment with the goal of passing legislation that would encourage fit parenthood while discouraging defective reproduction. In the United States, the American Eugenic Society's Committee on Formal Education began advising eugenic teaching in schools in 1925. And they considered the biological sciences as the most effective way to teach heredity and hygiene. And the committee advocated for the use of mental tests, which lent an air of scientific credibility. Similarly, Canadian students were tested, inspected, and categorized. And education provided an effective mechanism for normalizing ideas about health and ability. Much like human geneticist Madge Thurlow Macklin, Fraser believed that education played an important role in achieving a society improved through educators who came to understand and promote heredity. Another important aspect of hygiene teaching, wrote Fraser, is that it provides an indispensable prerequisite for the development of the eugenic attitude. On more than one occasion, he identified universities as important spaces of reform. There's no question in my mind, at least, that the universities in our country can, if they wish, make a definite and useful contribution. This is the quote up here. Fraser believed that public health education was necessary to develop people who cared, to correct faulty attitudes that couldn't be rectified by research and legislation, provide an ideal by which knowledge could be achieved, and to ensure, quote, lower and dysgenic classes of humans stop breeding more dysgenic generations, end quote. Public health reform in particular was an avenue through which promoters of eugenic thought could practice a range of activities, including education and surveillance of those living in poverty. And Roy Fraser, like his counterparts, promoted eugenics, including sterilization, as a solution to societal concerns and adopted the language of progressives and Christianity to appeal to sympathetic audiences. The progressive movement, including the social gospel movement, emerged as a charitable undertaking and became attractive to many who wanted to improve social conditions. And Fraser often contorted his interpretation of Christianity to promote eugenics. And in 1932, he explained to the annual meeting of the Canadian Life Insurance Officers Association in Toronto that, quote, the two greatest potentialities for good in the world today are Christianity and science. The first is the principal force, and the second is the principal tool, end quote. He recognized that perhaps eugenics was incongruent with the Christian doctrine to protect the most vulnerable, but argued that faith should be expressed through the scientific method, proclaiming that the highest form of compassion is prevention, the highest application of human biology is eugenics, that's a quote. This required a bit of mental gymnastics because preventative medicine was prolonging the lives of even the traditionally vulnerable members of the population, which meant either coming to terms with a longer life expectancy for everyone, regardless of potential genetic makeup, or attempting to cut out disease at the root, which was based on a loose understanding of genetics because environmental factors play a large part in susceptibility to illness, and some disorders that were assumed to be genetic are not. If there was any question as to why Fraser promoted eugenics as an appropriate response to societal problems, sometimes real and sometimes imagined, he explained that during his time as resident pathologist at Seaside Hospital in New York, he exclusively tended to sick infants and children suffering from chronic or long-term diseases. According to Fraser, and this is the quote that you see here, these wee patients were the children of the very lowest type of slum dwellers. Biologically, they were human trash, born of human trash. And we were busy saving them so that they, in turn, might reproduce more human trash and endlessly perpetuate and increase the problem of the afflicted and the unfit, their lives a burden to themselves and to society. The pediatric patients whose futures were already written, not because of the systemic inequalities that sustain poverty, but in Fraser's estimation, due to unfit genetics, required some sort of compassionate intervention. Prevention through eugenics seemed like a promising way to alleviate what Fraser called a cruel predestination. But the burden wasn't just moral, it was also financial. And Fraser, like other eugenicists, adopted an economic argument for surveillance and sterilization. Illness and poor health was costing Canada millions because, quote, at any given time, he argued, 70,000 of the Canadian working population are absent from work owing to illness. And this is a picture of Fraser with his mother. His mother, Margaret Fraser, was a registered nurse. And after she divorced, they moved to New York. And she was superintendent of the Seaside Home and Hospital in Brooklyn. So they would have been there together. In 1939, Fraser made an address entitled, "What Can the University Contribute to Public Health Education?" during a meeting of the Canadian Public Health Association to their Public Health Education section. It was also published in the Canadian Public Health Journal. And in this paper, Fraser specifically extolled the merits of personal hygiene and public health course, the course that he was teaching. In his estimation, by 1939, the course had been offered to 2,000 students who represented about 200 communities. And he explained that these students were taught the structure and function of the national and provincial health departments by assigning the annual reports and asking students to study the typical conditions in their own communities. In particular, Fraser wished that students would pay close attention to the work of public health nursing services and the activities of the Junior Red Cross in local schools. It was his assertion that communities which possessed conscientious health officers, a full-time public health nursing service, and an active Junior Red Cross had, quote, a better health record and a higher intelligence in health matters in general than is the case in a community which did not possess these blessings, end quote. He invoked the words of Dr. Haven Emerson, who's the inventor of the iron lung, who was also in attendance at the same CPHA meeting, and likened the promotion of health education to a religious crusade. Now, Fraser's fervor in connecting education to social reform wasn't unusual. Educational reformer John Dewey spent the first half of the 20th century promoting experiential education as the pathway to intelligent citizenship. Fraser's public health assignment, in particular, exhibits pedagogical approaches promoted by Dewey. His commitment to creating good citizens through community action incorporates Dewey's belief that education held a moral and civic purpose. However, Fraser's promotion of public health education, firmly rooted in eugenic ideology, would train students to become very specific types of community leaders and activists. So what do we find when we look at the course? The course's purpose and the students' work is the creation of a population that is strategically being trained to discipline themselves and act as surveillance of others in their home communities. The description for Biology 3 was expanded in detail from the 1930s to the 1950s, but remained generally the same. The 1951-52 academic calendar description is typical for the other years as well. This course aims to give students a working knowledge of personal and community hygiene, and to stimulate him toward the practical and effective application of that knowledge to his own physical improvement and the betterment of his community's health. There's the discipline and the surveillance. In addition to lectures, demonstrations, and extensive readings, the student is required to make a community health survey of his own home community and present a full report of his findings. During the winter holidays, students were required to complete their public health report. The community reports covered a number of services, infrastructure, and education initiatives listed here. Things like geography, population, housing, sewage disposal, and industries. The conditions of schools, their ventilation, medical inspection of schools, recreation facilities, organizations for children and young people. Any medical and public health services, any clinics, communicable diseases, maternal and infant mortality, public health nursing services like the VON and IODE, the Junior Red Cross, as well as nutrition, milk supply, and water supply. The main objective of the course was to motivate or inculcate students to incorporate hygiene practices in their personal lives and communities. And the assessment that helped fulfill this objective was a health survey of the students' home community. And from a curriculum point of view, it's actually pretty good course alignment. So, but when we look at what he did, it's actually very problematic. In addition to the promotion of eugenic thought, there were a number of factors that made the assignment problematic. So reports varied in length, anywhere from 3 pages to my father's 91-page report. Some students were provided with prior student work to inform the report. The final report was never returned to the students. Roy Fraser was using students to create his own public health records, and then of course this promotion of eugenic thought. So this violates a number of best practices that we now employ, including things like iterative feedback and assurance of student privacy. Placing students in the position of reporting about their own communities was also very problematic, as the assignments reveal. So it's evident, even without a specific assignment description, that the expectations of the public health report evolved and became more standardized over time. However, throughout the 20-year period, the tone conveyed by reports for communities in the South Shore of Nova Scotia remained fairly consistent. And for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to provide you with select examples from the student work, specifically from Lunenburg, Queens, Shelburne, Yarmouth, and Digby counties. And according to Erica Dick, this is a quote, the early applications of eugenics discourse worldwide focused primarily on marginalized populations, including poor communities and institutionalized groups of individuals deemed mentally ill, defective, and criminal. The reports affirm this preoccupation with marginalized peoples, and the student assignments often conflate poverty with immorality by applying this lens of eugenic thought. So according to many of the students from the South Shore region, poverty was a result of laziness, which corresponded with an ungrateful attitude. To the dismay of many students, this perceived laziness made families, and in particular men, dependent on charitable organizations or even the town. They described fathers who would drink their days away and mothers who did nothing but sit around and gossip. A student explained that those living in the slum area were, quote, contented to live in small tumble-down shacks and to be supplied with food when necessary from the town, end quote. Well, according to another report, men who resided in the slum area only worked long enough to acquire money to purchase alcohol. The father is lazy and barely makes enough money to keep the family from starving, explained one health report. Although the children get plenty of milk to drink from the 3 cows owned by the father, the conditions under which the cows live are terrible, and I would not think that the milk would be fit to drink. In this instance, despite the children's access to milk, in this case unpasteurized, the poor living conditions were extended to the livestock souring even the father's potential to contribute to the wellness of his family. It was if a family was perceived as less self-sufficient than hoped and received financial support from the town, students expected that at least some unspecified level of gratitude was required. Sometimes the perceived lack of gratitude from the families for the assistance they received was even more egregious to the students. Quote, they have no real sense of values, objected one student. These people are often critical and not at all pleased by the articles supplied to them by the women's organizations. They have been looked after for so long, they expect such donations as a matter of course and not as an act of kindness, end quote. In another community, the Women's Institute had been given credit for improving sanitary conditions in the school. Of course, as expected, complained another student, some families are ungrateful, and besides being lazy, especially husbands, they expect help continually and wish to stay in the town's good graces indefinitely. Community members living in poverty were considered both lazy and ungrateful, moral shortcomings that were associated with public health concerns. Like many social reformers, poverty was an indication to the students that the offending families were immoral. Aspects of ungodly living included alcohol consumption, illegitimate children, and inbreeding. It wasn't unusual for the public health reports to include a tally of illegitimate births in the communities for the reporting year. Quote, town name has its share of illegitimate births, explained a student. There were 2 illegitimate births, both living, during the year 1934. There are more cases than is known to the ordinary man, but most of the parents managed to get married in some way or another, end quote. Another student reported on a community member who had 3 illegitimate children and was shocked that nothing had been done about the situation. Illegitimacy was seen as a quantifiable occurrence that could measure immorality of the mother who, in the student's estimation, didn't care for her children, evidenced by their poor dress and lack of food. According to the reports, illegitimate children seemed to be the main contributor to overcrowding, which was a common health concern. Families who exceeded 5 members living together received additional attention. There's a belief among eugenicists that the least intelligent people had the largest families. Therefore, those who were considered feeble-minded were propagating at greater rates than the more intelligent citizens because they couldn't control their sexual impulses. This worked in concert with an assumption that large families, who often consisted of a number of illegitimate children and extended family members, living in potentially unsanitary conditions, or at least homes that may have been more difficult to maintain certain standards of hygiene, were also engaged in inbreeding and were generally immoral. A student reporting on their community concluded that Immorality associated with inbreeding has caused damage to some families' mental capacity, describing the family members' mentality as low, and some, they wrote, are indeed little better than morons. Some students suggested that social parasites in their town should be sterilized to eliminate the constant public nuisance. Now, according to historians, negative eugenics referred to policies and practices designed to prevent the reproduction of people who were considered unfit. Intelligent tests and medical evaluations were popularized and legitimized the definition of medical categories such as idiot, imbecile, and moron, as well as the criminalization of perceived feeble-mindedness. The public health assignments incorporate eugenics theory by associating poverty with intellectual ability and mental health. Students described community members as possessing low mentality, as feeble-minded, weak-minded, and morons. In the slum district, explained a student, live a few families of low mentality who seem to refuse to help in bettering themselves. Some of them work on the wharf, and there's no reason why they could not enjoy better living conditions. In this instance, what was deemed low mentality wasn't considered a reason why a person couldn't make something of themselves. Another student, the quote I have here, reported an alarming rate of insanity in their district of 1,000 people. In the community of town name, there is an alarming large number of mentally weak persons. There are about 25 noticeably insane and about twice that many that show signs of going insane. This large number may be due to the long intermarrying of a few families. There are 2 families in which there is a weak-minded child born every year, and at present, nothing can be done about it. There are 4 cases of illegitimacy. These children are under the care of the local Children's Aid Society. A few years later, another student from the same small town made a more modest estimate of 5 insane, but still attributed the cause to intermarrying. Now, the ability to identify and control the feeble-minded was important for reducing their influence on and inconvenience of the population. And this is a quote, it's up here. In regards to the mental deficiency, wrote a student in the 1930s, among the school children, Dr. Z reports 5. People of age 20, there are 2. None of these cases are caused by interbreeding. Absolutely nothing is being done for these people. The school allows these children to attend and mingle with others. Such things should be corrected and shows one of the 4 points. Similarly, another student reported that there were a few cases of mental deficiency within the town and the school population, but no one was doing anything about the situation, and the children were allowed to attend school until they dropped out. In this student's estimation, these community members then became a burden upon the town. Much like their professor, these students were concerned about the social burden associated with those who were determined to be mentally deficient. Laziness, immorality, and dubious intellect associated with poverty, which indicated questionable hygiene, were very rarely discrete categories, but almost always overlapped and informed each other. At times in the student reports, racial difference served as another characteristic associated with immorality and poverty. Race, as a determining factor for poor health, was less often identified in the reports. However, there were students who included an analysis of racialized populations. Health reports from one community included anti-Semitic discourse about the local Jewish community and associated any slum conditions with stereotypical terrible landlords. During the 1940s, the hotel in another town was commandeered by the Greek government as a residence for Greek sailors, and the student noted that many different races had intermarried already, making it difficult to determine what the future citizens of the town would be like. And according to the assignments, the French, as a racialized population, suffered from Catholic superstition and an abundance of illegitimate children. And of course, in this region, that would have been the Acadian population. African Nova Scotians in these counties typically lived in conditions one student referred to as, quote, dilapidated houses and shacks on the back street of town, and another student referred to as squalid conditions. Similar to assertions about the poor white population, African Nova Scotians were accused of producing numerous illegitimate children. One student reported that they could count 35 in a settlement of 200 people and estimated that probably over 1/3 of part of the district was illegitimate born. Students in one town adopted a more paternalistic tone when discussing the African Nova Scotian population, describing these community members as a hardworking class who had a fairly high standard of living. However, these observations also remain problematic as they continue to cast African Nova Scotians and the expectations of this population as different than middle-class whites. Unsurprisingly, there was little awareness of the systemic nature of poverty, and there were no sections on the social determinants of health in the reports. Those who experienced conditions of poverty in these communities were highly othered by the student surveyors. They were set apart geographically in their communities, near the dump, in the slum, on the south side, and additionally, these spaces were othered by the use of specific names like the Barrens, the Beehive, and Why Not Town. Physical othering easily facilitated the use of language that also served to set the middle-class students apart from their subjects. It's not surprising that those in poverty were often othered by the students who would repeatedly refer to families as those people or these people. Additionally, members of the community were sometimes othered through the use of comparison photographs. Throughout the 20th century, photography was a tool of surveillance, especially in documenting and revealing socioeconomic disparity. Health departments also began to create their own photographic records. For example, Dr. Charles Hastings, Medical Officer of Health for Toronto, incorporated photography into a 1911 study of the city slums. Students occasionally included photographs of the dwellings as well as the children living in the segregated areas, and set them in comparison with children whose homes were in the quote-unquote main part of town. Valerie Minette and others have noted that the links between poor housing and poor health were fairly entrenched by the 19th century, and often housing was considered an extension of the body. The early 20th century eugenic preoccupations with unhealthy bodies maintained this assumption, and it's unsurprising that students would use dwellings as another example of potential poor health and unfit populations. The most complete and explicit example of the promotion of eugenic thought in the counties was found in a report composed by a student who attended Mount Allison during the 1940s, went on to graduate from Dalhousie's medical school, and practice in another region of Nova Scotia. They used the majority of their assignment to promote eugenics theory. This student opened the report by citing a survey by Dr. Clarence Hinks, a prominent eugenics advocate and co-founder of the Canadian National Committee for Mental Health, which later became the Canadian Mental Health Association. According to this report, a 1933 survey performed by Hinks showed that their town had the second largest percentage of low-grade families per capita in the Dominion. The student clarified, quote, by low-grade families, I mean not only low living conditions and incomes, but above all, low intelligence. The report then surmised that because of the intellect of the community's population, intermarrying had been more likely, which further contributed to the assumed intelligence level. The report continued by conflating intermarrying and intellectual ability with a lack of morals because, quote, children are born by many unmarried girls, and in one or two cases, girls have born children for their own fathers. These are known cases. Many are probably unknown. The results are easily understood, end quote. The report used a specific family as an example for, in the student's estimation, 20 other families, described as the lowest type. It detailed the living conditions of the family, the mental health history of the mother, her 16 siblings, 3 were apparently found normal by health authorities, and her children, 6 of whom had been deemed, quote, low grade, very near imbeciles by the provincial psychiatrist. The report claimed that free cod liver oil, milk, and clothing wouldn't solve the problem of those with an imbecilic rating. The suggested solutions were suitable marriages and sterilization of, quote, those who are found lacking in intelligence and morals and with venereal diseases, which would benefit future generations by improving the race as a whole. A conference had been organized in this community to discuss sterilization, but a certain religious denomination wouldn't allow the discussion to take place. And we can assume that was the Catholics, who were often outspoken against policies and approaches promoted by eugenicists. A report from 1951 to 52 of the same small town noted that there was no real slum area compared to cities, and the problem areas have been greatly improved for the following reasons. Wartime supplied men with work, and their wages were used to improve their homes. The Vaughan Victoria Order of Nurses focused efforts in those areas. Children's allowances became available and well used, and school attendance was mandatory until age 16. And church and town organizations also provided aid. The positive changes were attributed to the VON surveillance efforts and mandatory education, but there was no mention of sterilization or feeble-mindedness. While some students took Fraser's emphasis on eugenic ideology very seriously, not every student entirely adopted his perspective on public health. Overall, Fraser was pleased with the students' submissions and claimed that many of the reports were very thorough and exceeded the work of more experienced health workers. He thought that his public health course would fulfill the desired goal of higher education and produce engaged and informed citizens. From this small sample of assignments, it's evident that some of Roy Fraser's students replicated eugenic perspectives. In my father's graduating year, the introductory letter from Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, printed in the Mount Allison yearbook, emphasized the importance of university education to create future leaders. At no period of history, this is a quote, at no period in history have our universities been called upon to play a more significant role in Canadian society. Not only are they expected to perform the traditional duty of custodian and the accumulated knowledge of mankind, but they're also expected to produce young men and women fitted to give leadership in a troubled and complex age. This isn't an uncommon sentiment that continues to be embraced by universities across the country. However, if you ask my father, I suspect he would have told you that Fraser's personal hygiene and public health course didn't entirely contribute to good citizenship. So what about my father? And here he is again. This wasn't my father's worst course. He didn't do terribly. In fact, he achieved academically. His report garnered a top grade, an A, comments from Roy Fraser on the front, and his transcripts indicate that he did very well in Biology 3. My father's community health report is informative, but mundane. There's no othering, no mention of class differences or association of dirt or communicable diseases with poverty or immorality. Any areas of improvement were presented as community concerns. For example, nutrition education was important for all school children and their parents, and access to public school education should be made available for those who desired it. So how can we make sense of his recollection of the course? Some anthropologist asks, how do we know that our life history participants what they tell us is correct? And often conclude through observation, interviewing others, and comparing participant accounts to other available sources. Julie Cruikshank explains that taking orally narrated accounts seriously doesn't suggest that they speak for themselves in any simple way or that their meanings are self-evident. As an insider considering my father's life story, I benefit from an ability to contextualize his feelings of inadequacy in this course with what I knew about his childhood, upbringing, and socioeconomic class, and the general assumptions that were made about the community in which he lived. In 1928, he was born to Dorothy Vino, a young, unmarried woman. My father would have been considered one of the illegitimate children counted in the other student assignments. Dorothy married his stepfather, Orrin Joudrey, when George was about 8 years old. They lived in a small one-room house with my father's grandmother, without electricity or modern plumbing. His family participated in subsistence farming and certainly would have been considered poor. Eugenics discourse strongly associated poverty with intelligence and immorality, an assumption that wouldn't have been lost on my father. He couldn't have disguised who he was or where he came from, in part because of the presence of a noticeable regional accent commented on next to his graduation photograph in the yearbook. Additionally, 3 years after his graduation from Mount Allison, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis and spent 8 months in the Roseway Sanatorium in Shelburne. At the end of his life, Roy Fraser wrote a short book entitled Happy Journey, which is part autobiography and part personal philosophy. What it lacks in substance, it makes up for in sentimentality. The preface was authored by a former student who reflected on his time in Biology 3, which was the only course that he took with Fraser, and confessed that, quote, like thousands of others, this contact of 1 hour a week for the period between September and Christmas made me a deeply devoted admirer of RF. There were other students at Mount Allison who took as many as 8 or 9 courses with Fraser. Some pursued pre-medical study and referred to themselves as the Fraserites. This former student and admirer of Roy Fraser observed that when hundreds of Fraserites, so quote, came to power in their various fields, they heaped many honors upon their beloved professor. As an instructor, Fraser seems to have had some success harnessing education as a mechanism for social control to inculcate a specific type of civic duty. Gerald O'Brien, in his book Framing the Moron, points out that, quote, identifying the target group as deviant or apart from the norm is also a means of affirming the foundational values of the prevailing status quo or of reinforcing expected normative behavior. The health reports provided an ideal vehicle for reinforcing the norm for the students whose personal experiences perhaps aligned more closely with the eugenicists' expectations. But for students like my father, they would have seen themselves in the other. Thank you.
Stop sharing for a moment. And I would say that, sorry, I saw the clapping. If you're in the online audience and you would like to ask Dr. Joudrey a question, if you could put them into the chat. We have Abigail Keeping standing by to collect those. And if we have any questions live, maybe we'll turn to those first while everyone has a chance to think about that. Oh, and we.
I found it really interesting how nowadays it's seen as traditional to have large families, and back then it was seen as like a bad thing.
Sure,
And
yeah.
I think that's just really interesting to me. And I thought the framing of the houses was also really interesting, and how the shacks were framed in like front facing or like sort of like a downward position, rather than the other houses which were framed in a more casual view.
Sure, yeah. No, that's a good observation. Thank you.
Oops. Are there any other questions? Oh, you have Blake. Blake, are you there?
Hi. Can you hear me?
We will be able to in one moment. There, by now.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear him.
We can hear you, yes.
Excellent. Thanks, Susan. I just want to say I really enjoyed this talk. I don't know how many other people in the audience had the honor of knowing your father, but I did, of course. You guys lived, you know, a few blocks away, and I went to the same church, so it was really nice to see the old pictures on a very personal basis and to hear the story of his experience. I was also very pleased that you know, because I was waiting with bated breath till the end to find out what was he going to write, right? Was it going to be, and you know, it turns out he did write something that reflected, you know, his background. I think his decency. I did want to ask you though, kind of to reflect a little bit on your experience of getting this document written by your father and how you approached it. You know, I suspect you were probably a little bit nervous when you found out it was in existence and you were going to read this very long report written by your father. So I just wanted to hear your kind of thoughts on that.
Sure. I love to tell that story. So when I started thinking about that course in particular, I was working at Dalhousie as an educational developer, specifically in curriculum, And as all of us who are at universities know, it's always hard to stick a course into a curriculum. Everybody's like, there's too many courses, there's too much stuff, not enough time. You can't have anything else. So I was wondering, what was it about this course? First of all, this is my first thought, like what was important about it that made it mandatory? So that was why I reached out to David and Winnie and was just like, can you tell me something about this course? Supposedly my dad said it was mandatory for everyone. This would have been the 1950s. And he immediately responded with, oh, I think this is the course description. I think this is the course. And I looked at it and I was like, yes, I think you're right. I think that's the course. So then he emailed me back and said, I have your dad's assignment. Do you want me to scan it and send it to you? And of course I was like, yes. And then I asked, how many of these assignments do you have? And he said, 9 meters. And I was like, oh my. So then that was kind of in the winter of 2019. I made arrangements to go up to the archives in the summer of 2019 to take a look with the thought that I would go back again and look at some more documents. So I mostly looked at the South Shore just because that's where Dad was from. And then I did look a little bit at Halifax, Truro, around the Shubenacadie area as well, because I was kind of interested to see about any reference to First Nations or Indigenous in particular. But then when I went up to meet with David, he's like, oh, did you know that Roy Fraser was a eugenicist? And I was like, no, I didn't. So then it gave this whole other meaning, I guess, to why Dad thought that this was his worst class. His actual worst class, for my poor father is rolling his grave right now, his actual worst class was philosophy. But this class was actually kind of in his mid-range, followed by, above that was his history classes. So definitely not his worst class, and he did very well in it. But yeah, that's kind of the story about how I ended up going and looking at the documents in the archive. But my dad's report was 91 pages. It's like he was overcompensating for how much he hated the course, I think, with all sorts of maps and yeah, that he had hand drawn. So it was special to have a copy of as well. Thanks, Blake.
Simon?
I have a question. I am curious about the blurring of field work, biology. I mean, because the hygiene field work, progressive era social work makes sense to me. And then the immunology, public health makes sense, but it's a biology course.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, like, is that like universities were smaller, departments were smaller, and more things happened in one course? Or is this a particular moment where all these things have this umbrella because they all were looking at this sort of social improvement?
I think in the case of Mount Allison,
Okay.
it was just that they happened to have Roy Fraser. Like, I think that and Mount Allison is a very small university, it was a very small university then. And he was the biology department, like he taught everything. So everything was going to have a bit of the Roy Fraser dazzle on it, regardless of which biology class they were taking.
Yeah.
But he was a huge proponent of this type of education in particular, like that public health education.
Right.
And was invited to speak to nursing graduates at Dalhousie and Dal Medical. So the connection to medical and nursing and health professionals in particular, he was very keen on. And I think part of that was his time in New York and also the background of his mother. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to be too like psychological about it, but
No, but in the US, settlement house model,
yep.
These things all make sense.
Right.
They all are working together.
Yep.
And so I just didn't know if they had really just been transplants, because it does look really familiar.
Yep.
Like, oh, of course, your hereditary sciences, biology, and social work are one thing.
Yep.
It's 1930, like,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so.
And Leslie has definitely written on those types of merging as well. Yeah.
Which is why I love this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see you get a couple questions in the chat. Abigail, did you want to share those?
Yeah, I can read them out here. So a question from Elizabeth. She says, "Thank you. That was really interesting. The course and the reports made me think of Charles Davenport's eugenic field workers who were sent out to investigate communities and individuals. I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at any of those and maybe see if Mount Allison research was modeled on what Davenport had done."
I have not, but thank you, because now I will. So I really appreciate that.
And then there's another question from Shira. They say, "Thanks very much for this fascinating and infuriating presentation. I was really struck by the quote from Fraser that repeatedly referred to people as trash. What a shocking quote. It is unfortunately still common to refer to people, especially impoverished people, as trash. I'm thinking especially of the term white trash. Just wondering if that language was common among eugenicists. Did it appear in some of these reports?"
I didn't see any of the students specifically talking about trash, but definitely things like social parasites. You could tell that there was a real unworthiness of that group of people. You also mentioned common. Before we started, I was talking to Leslie about every time I kind of revisit this work, something else has happened in the news, whether it's what's happening in Lower Sackville with the pallet homes and our unhoused community members and the way people are reacting to the unhoused community members, or if it's what's happening right now with MAID as well. It seems to still have, like you said, that connection to the present. But to use the word kind of garbage and trash, the students didn't really replicate that language, but the sentiment was there. Definitely, for some of them, not all of them, but for some. And I agree, that's a shocking quote. It's kind of why I include it, because it is shocking, but even I have a hard time reading it out loud. I find it so unsettling.
I'll just point out, Elizabeth Kester has said she thinks the reports of the ERO field workers should be archived in the American Philosophical Association.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Are there any more questions? Oh, we'll go here.
In the students' reports, did they make any distinctions between like African and Scotia for like images for like, or did they all kind of group into one class of like social parasites?
Right. The student reports commented on race less than I initially thought they would. But what I found is there were some similarities between the way that African Nova Scotians were talked about and the way that white poor were talked about in particular. Now, I have looked at and one of the reasons I started to look at some of the Halifax ones when I was at the archives was I was kind of curious about if the students mentioned Africville and how their situation of their contextualization of Africville would be. They don't mention it. It's like Africville is a whole other place. Yeah. So most of the students didn't even report on Africville as part of the city of Halifax. So there wasn't as much about racialized populations as I initially thought there would be, but there was this very prevalent idea of race betterment for, white middle class individuals. Yeah.
There are two questions. One, people who went to university and were previously considered undesirable, did that change once they graduated? And the second question is, has there been an uptick recently of the university graduates are better, quote unquote, sort of ideas?
Oh, that's interesting. So I did ask my dad, because I was kind of curious while he was still alive. I asked him if he ever felt like he didn't fit in at Mount Allison, because he was there on a scholarship, and the scholarship was really the only reason he could go to university. And the reason he got a scholarship was because he was a white man. So, and it was after the Second World War. So I did ask him that. He said, no, not really. But then when I look at like the yearbook entry and commenting on his Lunenburg County accent, I was like, I don't know. I feel like there was maybe a little bit of friction. Did that change when when someone like him would have been graduated? I think that some people didn't know his background completely. He stayed in Lunenburg County, so his accent would not have been a big problem. People would have accepted it for what it was. But there's one woman from near where he lived, and my mother always commented about how she would comment how great it was that he married a girl from New Brunswick outside of the community. So still this idea of like, oh, you're from this place that has a long history of poverty and still does. I'm so glad you didn't intermarry. So there was still that like kind of shadow, I guess, on who he was by people who would have known him previously. Yeah.
How do you think they rationalize the idea that intermarrying is bad, but being with somebody of a different race is also bad? How do you think they rationalize that?
They did all sorts of things to rationalize all sorts of terrible ideas. So yeah, really what I say, like he contorted kind of the tenets of Christian faith in order to support, like, I'm doing society a favor, I'm doing these children a favor by sterilizing them so that they don't breed and continue on. Like, that is a big mental jump from helping the vulnerable or not caring about the oppressed and poor, right? So I think that I don't think that we'd be able to figure out like a logical rationalization, but people are able to find like that financial piece is huge. Like, oh, this is such a financial burden to the rest of the population. If we convince people, and there were companies that were doing intelligence testing with the people who worked there and then persuading them to be sterilized if they got certain grades on their intelligence test. So they found all sorts of different pieces to try and justify the things that they believed, but I don't think I'd call any of it particularly rational. If that makes sense. Because I don't know if that answered your question. Okay.
It makes sense. So Abigail, I see there's a few more questions online.
Yeah. So Vincent asked, in a similar vein to what Elizabeth asked regarding Davenport's field workers, were there any references to eugenic family studies like the Jukes or Kaliaks? Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Were there discussions of family pedigree charts and the like?
Not in such detail, and I don't think that Roy Fraser actually gave them a lot of instruction about where to go and find good information. So they had a textbook. It was kind of a standard textbook for this type of course. And I think, you know, like I said, sometimes he would let students use the reports from the same community from different students. So they'd have those to go on. But there was never any sort of kind of detailed instruction. So I never saw any pedigree charts. The students would use specific families as examples sometimes. They'd say such and such family and then describe some of the pedigree background. But there was they never drew out any charts in the report. So I'd say that, you know, they weren't going, or he wasn't giving that much detailed instruction for them to follow those types of formats.
Almost like he was using them as a blank slate to send them out and get it without giving them that bit of information.
Yeah, that's a good point, Leslie, because I think, yeah, I think early on, I don't think he really knew what it was he wanted to look for. But then as a student who's getting these student reports, all of a sudden it's like, oh, they should think more about what's happening in the schools, or, oh, I would like to know. I think it was mostly like, I would like to know more about, and then it kind of took shape that way. But I think you're right. I think kind of initially he thought fieldwork is a good practice, but I don't think that he necessarily had a background in doing a lot of field work himself. So, yeah.
I mean, this is why I was asking,
Yeah.
because it's like, because I'm thinking Chicago school,
Sure, yeah.
Park, you know, all that. And then, but that's why I think that's a good question about like, what are they actually going out into the field with? If 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 this, like, what's the hygiene aspect
Right.
of a hygiene course?
Right,
You know,
right.
that's, I mean, that's kind of, were they getting that, here's 5 sections to look at, here's
Right, right.
5, you know, is that from a hygiene field, is that, you know, like, or is he really just pulling on his ass and being like, here, go?
I think in
Probably
some,
more than
yeah, I
that.
think in
Yeah.
some part, at some points, he was kind of pulling it out, but also, like, when I talk about the assignment and whether or not it's ethical, some of these students didn't actually go home to their communities over the Christmas break. So there is one student report from a student who's from Massachusetts,
Right,
who's spending the holidays in Yarmouth, and is like, I don't know any, like, in her report, she's like, I didn't know anything about this community. I did the best I could. Whereas there are other students whose parents are in the medical field, and they're like, oh, I went and talked to this public health officer, and I went to talk to this, right, and got this report. So, you know, part of the unethical part of the assignment, among all other things, is that not all the students had access to this, right, to the same people, or to the same knowledge, or even to the geographic region where they were residing for the Christmas break. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Elis- Oh, perfect. Okay. Elizabeth left a question saying that they were really interested in your dad's conclusions. They were not what I had expected in the context of this course, and there seemed to be a bit of a disconnect with his high mark. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, and in education, we talk a lot about creating a sense of belonging. That if your students feel like they belong in a course, they tend to, regardless of their academic achievement, actually enjoy the course. And when I put Dad into the context of this course and the fact that it was being taught by eugenicists, I suspect he just never felt like he belonged in that course. So he always, I guess, for the rest of his life, because he'd bring it up every so, oh yeah, when I was at Mount Allison, I had this one course, it was terrible, it was my worst course. And so I always thought, because in my experience, if I was going to talk about my worst course, I'd be talking about the course I withdrew from. Like that was my worst course. Like I was not academically achieving in it. But for Dad, it wasn't about the academic achievement. It was about how much he actually enjoyed or didn't enjoy the course, or felt like he, I guess, belonged in that space. And he definitely felt like he would have disagreed with the majority of the things that Roy Fraser would have been teaching just because of his own lived experience. And so it's a kind of, for me too, as someone who also thinks about education, like it's a really important reminder, like how do we make sure we create spaces in our classroom where students don't need to hide part of themselves, they can still feel like they belong, and we're still giving them the feedback that they need to be able to understand what they're learning and in a really meaningful, useful way. So.
Could I just ask a follow-up? Is that if that's not breaching the etiquette of all the people that have asked questions, it is just I'm just so fascinated with the idea of your dad in this course and being asked to do these things, and him kind of feeling anxious about his own context. But he got a really high mark, and he got real accolades for his work. And yet the things that he concluded were surprised me because they weren't that he didn't kind of toe the line. So I thought that was really interesting too. He got a fantastic comments from the prof about it being the best ever, and yet the comments weren't really the sort of pro-eugenic comments that you would have thought he might have imbibed or were necessary to get such high mark. So I wonder if you just have any reflections
For
on that.
sure. It was surprising to me too. When I got the assignment, it was like, this assignment about a small community can't be beat. Like this is the pinnacle of Roy Fraser's small community assignments. So the community is about 150 people who live there. And, you know, dirt roads, really late access to electricity and plumbing, even into the 1950s. So I think when I think about my dad's assignment being 91 pages, so far exceeded the number of pages for many of the reports, which may have maxed out kind of around 25 were kind of the big reports, and then there were some that were 10, and then there were a few reports that were just 3 pages. But then there was my dad's, which was this huge report, and I think he really felt, I don't know, now I'm kind of projecting a little bit, I think, but it may have been that he felt like, I'm going to stick it to this guy by producing this fantastic report on this tiny, tiny community that really does reflect on, like, he talks about the houses and how the houses are a lot of bare wood, not finished wood, which makes it hard to keep the dust away, and how difficult, like, that the buildings are to keep clean to a standard that might be considered hygienic in other places. So he, you know, he contextualized, like, this is the community, this is the, we got this one room schoolhouse, it's got a wood stove, it probably needs a little better ventilation, we do open the windows, but it gets really cold in the winter. So he was able to use some of these kind of public health principles that we think about, like he talks about measles and communicable diseases and how we don't even know that the kids have it and they come to school and then it goes through the community. And so he uses that kind of knowledge and presents it. So it demonstrates that he has learned something, but it's all very from this kind of like community aspect, like what can the community do to make any sort of public health improvements for the entire community without singling out, never talks about individual families, never mentions illegitimate births. And so it's different than than a lot of the other reports, but it's also massive. And I really do think he was like, I'm going to show this guy. But I don't think my dad ever saw that report again. Like once he handed that 91 pages in, all handwritten, into the van, he never saw it. It became part of the Roy Fraser public health collection. So I don't know if my father ever really would have known how well he had done on that report either. But he would have known what his final grade was, which was still very good grade. But you're right, it is a interesting, and like I said, it was kind of eye-opening for me too in terms of teaching and the classroom and what we ask students to do and how we ask them to do it and the type of culture that we create in the classroom. It gave me a lot to reflect on. Thank you for your interest.
Abigail, would you like to read the next one?
Yeah, so another question from Martha. They say, thanks, Sue. My dad was in the 1955 graduating class. Did ideas of regionalism tie into these assessments of maritime communities, for example, backwards maritimers?
That's a good question, Martha. I think because the student population at Mount Allison was mostly from Atlantic Canada, the large majority. And then there were some later on from the West Indies. There's a whole section of public health reports from students who are international students from the West Indies, which I haven't looked at, but that's going to be very interesting to see how they make sense of what Roy Fraser is asking them to do. But there was never really like an outsider perspective on the backwards. Even the student from Massachusetts, when they were writing about Yarmouth, it was never like, oh my goodness, Yarmouth. It was kind of like, oh, well, here's what I know about this area. But it was definitely more socioeconomic class. And so I think you didn't get the regionalism, like kind of backward maritimer idea, or even the Atlantic region, because the students were from those communities. But there was definitely that class disparity, huge. Like it was like, oh, like I said, those people or these people, referring to individuals who were living in poverty.
Interesting that they don't see the maritimerness because they're maritime.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Because Vince definitely saw the maritimerness when he surveyed the province of Ontario.
Right, yeah, exactly. And where they grew up here, and a lot of them are Like I said, like some of them, their families are lawyers or doctors, and they come from a higher, I guess, socioeconomic class. They see their families as being, you know, the ideal in a lot of ways, and then they compare themselves to anyone who is in poverty. Yeah.
Oh, we've got one from Amanda there, Abigail.
Sorry, I missed that one there.
I did too.
So Amanda also left a comment a bit further up that I'll read at the same time. Amanda says, the sentiment had been there for so much longer than the scope of this project. But that being said, I am horrified that this was so formalized in this way, and also that this was so normalized in schools after eugenics of World War II. And then their question is, do you think your dad said that this was his worst class because he didn't like the content and not because of his overall grade?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think it was, I mean, I don't know how much he would have liked Roy Fraser too when I read Roy Fraser's book, and he is extremely sentimental. And I don't think my father was particularly that sentimental in the same way. So there might have been a personality conflict there. My father was older when he went to school compared to some of his peers at the university. So that would have made a difference, I think, as well, that he would have had a sense of his own as well. And he had already accomplished quite a bit. He had been a teacher for a number of years and gone to normal school. So he had kind of been around, I guess, for a little bit, even at 25. But I think you're right. Like, I think it is about the content, not agreeing with everything that was being taught more than his actual final grade. Yeah.
Do you think his achievements partially are what would have made him feel like the course wouldn't have been that great? No, I'm trying to
Oh,
figure out this
sure.
question.
Yeah, yeah.
But do you get what I'm saying? We're like,
I do.
because he achieved so much, he's like, well, I achieved so much and I didn't have this university degree.
Yeah, I suspect, and honestly, like when he talked about finally going to university, he would say, I wanted to try university. So he took a couple courses in the summer one year, and I think chemistry and history, and then he was like, oh, I might as well continue to do a degree. But I think you're right. Like, I think that a piece of it was that he had had other experiences in the world, even at 25, because he had started teaching when he was 17. And then had done other, obviously, schooling. So I think he had enough confidence maybe in who he was and his experiences that he was like, this course isn't as great. Why does everyone have to take it? Because he always did mention like everyone had to take this course and it was my worst course. So it is kind of it's a bit of a guessing game at this point, but it is interesting to think about.
We're 15 minutes past, which is fantastic. I'm so pleased that there were so many questions and such a great discussion. So I'm going to say thank you so much to Susan. And I'll give you another round of applause, virtual and otherwise. And invite everyone to join us next week when Daniel Meister will be giving a talk at the same time on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Atlantic. And by all means, if anyone has any questions or would like to get in touch with Susan, maybe you can reach out to me and I can pass along information.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming and listening to my story.
Just before we go, Jane says they are a faculty member at Mount Allison.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's such important history and notes. So
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
yes. Yes. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.